Right. Everybody hear us? Some people trickling in the lobby. All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. Today we'll be discussing the importance of having a mind-eye connection.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I wanted to give a quick background of mind-eye history. There's a new book coming out called All in the Mind by Lynn Malcolm in Australia. She interviewed Clark Elliott and myself for part of this book. It's about different people she's interviewed over the past many, many years. Most people who are on this broadcast should be familiar with The Ghost in My Brain that Clark Elliott had written. It's about in 2008 when he came to my office after 8 years of misery. He found Donnelly Marcus, who is the founder of Designs for Strong Minds, and she recommended that he come to the Mind Eye Institute, and the two of us together helped put his brain back together again. She from a cognitive aspect and me from a perception aspect. He wrote this book to help other people. It has been worldwide, and in Australia, Lynn Malcolm found it, and that's why she put the All in the Mind. I founded the Mind Eye in 1992, so we're 31 years old right now, and we've grown thanks to our incredible staff that Zemin Abibi has put together. And this year, the Society for Neuroscience I'm a member of and active there, learning new neuroscience and connecting it to optometry. But I'm using that in the Brain Mapping and Therapeutics Society as their newly elected president to change the way that the world looks at eye care. And we start looking at it as brain care. I'll be at the Alzheimer's Convention in Amsterdam with a couple of other people from the brain mapping group. And together we're just going to be exploring the possibility that retinal stimulation can affect brain function even more than people thought. So there's a book on autism by Patricia Lemmer, who wrote about my Bell test and how auditory and visual systems link. And there's a book called The Brain's Way of Healing by Norman Deutsch. And in the paperback version, in the afterword, he mentions Donnelly Marcus and myself as people on the forefront of neuroscience. And then Patrick Quaid in Canada wrote a book called Seeing to Learn, Learning to See. If you click, was it Seeing to Learn, Learning to See? And I have a chapter in that on how visual auditory integration is so important. So with that as an introduction, and also I work as a member of the medical advisory board for Hope for HIE, who just revamped their website. So take a look at Hope for HIE. That's hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, children who've had a loss of oxygen to their brain when they're born. And they do some phenomenal work with the leadership of Betsy Pillen. So click. So our goals today are to talk about the importance of having a mind-eye connection, to talk about how perception of auditory and visual space affects learning, and talk about how eyeglasses can affect the awareness of your surroundings, both for auditory space and visual space, and how our mind-eye brainware can influence the perception of surrounding space, and then a little bit of how COVID is affecting visual processing. So realize that the brain is connected directly to the spinal cord. The spinal cord is an extension of the brain going down, and the retina is an extension of the brain coming forward. And when you're using your brain to pay attention to an eye chart, typically you're looking at a letter on a flat surface, and you're not looking at the other 94% of the surroundings. So Patrick Quaid, who wrote that other book, has determined that it's 94% versus 6%. And it's important, not only can you see something, but how quickly you can shift what you're looking at from place to place. So the blue circle drawn here is the is conscious awareness, whereas the white line is conscious attention. And then the green is subconscious awareness. So you're aware of your surroundings, but not consciously. When you're reading, you should be consciously aware of the book and the paragraphs and the end of the lines. Somebody wrote that they can't hear anything either, but the closed captions work. So is that new or that's?
Can someone confirm in chat if they can hear?
Can everybody hear?
Yeah.
Oh, you hear, okay, thanks, you can hear, great.
All right, excellent. And for those of you wondering if the webinar will be recorded, yes, and we'll certainly send it out to all the attendees afterwards as well.
Thank you. So on the previous picture, it just shows how the regular eye exam is useful to standardize optometry, but perception of auditory space also is important. And just like the picture showed a blue and green background for what you saw, there's the same type of background that's not drawn for your ears. When you hear a target, or if you're aware of the background noises, and different parts of your brain work on different parts of that auditory background. So I have patients who are very sensitive, and if we have a copy machine running in the background or a fan running in the background, they can't concentrate. There are people who can't study in college unless everything's quiet. They have to go to a library, and other people who can study with tons of noise because they just tune everything out. So that shifting of your background ability, tuning out sounds or tuning out visual clutter, is a skill that can be developed in children. So how the perception of auditory and visual space affects learning, you can see, go back one slide. You can go back, go forward one slide. There. COVID has changed how we visually process. Typically, children sit in a room, they look at a teacher, or college students look at it in a hall, with hundreds of people at the teacher on the stage. They look at a PowerPoint, and the space, when we looked at that picture with the green space and the blue space, in a typical old-fashioned classroom, you look at the teacher like they were looking at the letter chart, and you're aware of everybody else and you tune them out. But now a lot of people are on Zoom meetings like this, and you're squashing the amount of space you're seeing all at one time. And you're having to, in your mind, picture the three-dimensional space. So if I'm sitting here and a teacher is in real time, real space, and I look across a room, that's one thing. But if I look on a screen that's flat and have to imagine in my mind that the teacher's back at the back of a room, you have to create visual space in your mind. It's the same concept as a backup camera in a car. If you're used to turning your head and looking around to back your car up, you're used to a big amount of space. Now you have to look at a small little camera, and you have to picture in your mind whatever's on that flat screen is really a three-dimensional space. And even though the screen is 7 or 8 inches wide, it's representative of huge amounts of space. So it's a hard shift for some people and an easy shift for other people. Now we can flip. So when 2020 was invented 161 years ago, the peripheral stimulation didn't move around like this. There weren't highways with traffic, with street signs that are cluttered, and you didn't have to use your central eyesight and shift from place to place to place. So that's fine for this day and age for people who can handle that shift, but not for the patients with anything going on with their brains. Flip the people who have problems going on with their brains often find sights and sounds and smells mismatched, and everything pours into their brain, but the information is jumbled and confusing. And the more confusion they get into, the more stress chemicals come in their body. And the more stress chemicals that come in their body, the more their peripheral eyesight takes either a fight or a flight or a freeze mode. If it goes into fight mode, the periphery gets hypersensitive. Then anything bothers them. And if it goes into flight mode, the periphery constricts and they tunnel and they zoom in one little spot. And if they go into freeze mode, they just freeze, almost like playing dead with like possums, playing possum dead. And they're just stuck. And everything that happens around them, they get dissociated from it. So flip this. When you do a typical eye exam, the peripheral eyesight is blocked off. So you're testing mostly the central eyesight, which is used to see straight ahead. Flip the. So the 20/20 testing is fantastic for most people, but the people that we see at the Mind Eye Institute typically have something not quite plugged in properly with their brain. Either it didn't get plugged in during development, or it got unplugged and disrupted from some sort of accident or stress, because you can have emotional trauma that triggers problems too. So those types of people need more testing than just seeing a stationary target on a flat surface. There's not even reaction time. In a regular eye exam, they say which is better, 1 or 2, and then you can sit and think about it as long as you want, and you can point your eyes and take time. But in life, when you're walking around, sometimes you have to react really quickly. So you might have crystal clear 20/20 eyesight, but you might not be able to see clearly quickly. There's statistics showing that 75% of children who have learning problems have difficulty reading, and 20% of the children with learning disabilities have difficulty with visual processing. It's a lot of people. So a different way to think about eye tests is here. So this looks a little bit complicated and like a big spider. But if you look at the blue in the center, that represents your mind. There's a little S and C for conscious and subconscious mind. And then the red surrounding the blue, that's representative of your body. And it has 5 senses of inputs into your body. So it has your eyes, your ears, your nose for smell, hearing, seeing, and then also your hand and your mouth for taste and touch. But the taste and touch are close senses, like you have to be close to something to taste it and touch it. But the eyes and ears and nose, they're designed for perceiving things really far away. So those are your far senses versus near senses. And then each of the the green arrows going into the red body. So there's 3 of them going into each of the senses. So one says C for conscious, one says S for subconscious, and one says U for unconscious. So you have unconscious, subconscious, and conscious inputs to your eyes, your ears, your nose, your hands, your mouth. And when we're talking about that 20/20 testing, it's conscious. It's can you see the target? Put your mind on it, look at it, take your time, think about it. So it's just that one green arrow at the top with the C going into the eye. That's your conscious part of your eyesight. And all the rest of those are connected, but were eliminated during the typical testing. Now the red at the bottom, there's 3 red arrows coming out, and they're labeled I for intentional, H for habit, and R for reflex. And there are 3 different modes of movement. So your brain makes a decision whether it's done at a reflex level and you're not thinking about it, whether it's done at a habitual level, or whether it's done with a planned movement. But there's 3 types of motor outputs you can have. So all of this happens constantly all day long. At an unconscious level, you have postural stability. At a subconscious level, you have spatial awareness of space and time. And at a conscious level, you have whatever you're putting attention on. So people who have ADD and poor attention, sometimes there's a problem in one of the lower levels. And if you address that, then all of a sudden their attention becomes better. So it's a different way to think about eye tests. Can we go backwards? So eyeglasses, yeah, there. So it's a different way to think about eye tests. You flip forward one level. So eyeglasses themselves can affect the awareness of surroundings. And if you click, it'll show you the next one. Yeah, the next one. There. One of the things we can do with eyeglasses by changing the surroundings is at an unconscious reflex level, affect posture. So the first picture on the left is a standard person standing, looking straight ahead with that central and peripheral awareness. But if we shift your body at the hips forward and backwards, you can have your space go upwards or downwards. And there's different kinds of glasses we can use to do that. So if we shift everything upward, your eyes will reflexively at an unconscious level go upward. Then your chin will go up and your hips will push, so you'll lean back. We can use a different kind of lens to pull everything downward. So if you have lower back pain, you can use glasses to lean forward or lean backwards and shift your hips back and forth on an anterior-posterior axis. We can also, as the third picture shows, rotate the shoulders to the right or to the left, clockwise or counterclockwise, by angling the light from the side. So we can use glasses where light comes in and then comes from the sides. And then again, reflexively at an unconscious level, your posture shifts. And then the subconscious level, the awareness of the space around you shifts as your body rotates. So if you have a knee problem and you're favoring one knee, the third picture here has a line drawn down the left leg to show how the person's putting more weight. There's more weight bearing on one leg than the other. And we can use eyeglasses to shift the person the other way to equalize how their weight bearing is. Because again, when you make the posture more stable, the awareness changes and the patient can be able to shift their gaze from place to place more easily. The last picture is shifting just the shoulders where the hips don't get involved. So the first picture is typical. The second picture is the anterior posterior shift of the hips. The third picture is rotation of the hips right and left. And the fourth picture, the hips are staying stable, but the shoulders pull back and forward. If they pull back, the eyes pull out. If your shoulders crunch forward, your eyes pull in. So again, with these posture shifts in the visual space, we can control that with glasses. But as you change the visual space, the auditory space also shifts. And different people react differently to it because some people live by their auditory space and other people live by visual space. And one of the things we work with patients is, can you tolerate visual clutter? Can you tolerate auditory clutter? What do you do? Do you shut down? Does it bother you? Can you deal with one but not the other? It would tell us which parts of their brain are working more than the other ones are. Can you flip the paper? Thanks. So we look at eyeglass prescriptions, and your shoulder and hip components should be balanced with each other. So there's 3 numbers on your, typically on glasses. On the right-hand side, it says sphere, cylinder, and axis. And on the left-hand side, it tells what they do. So the first number, the sphere, is usually telling us what the eyesight is. You can be a -5 or a +2 or a +1/4 or -10. And whatever number that is, that tells us how much space around them they are comfortable with. So if they're, say, a -2, that means that they don't see things really far away. They see things closer to them. And -6 would see things even closer. So that's their their visual world. They call it a visual space world. The second number talks about how the shoulders and the upper back are tensed up. And if it's different on the right side and the left side, then you're going to get neck problems or shoulder problems or upper back problems. We had someone who had written a question earlier who's a personal trainer and was asking about the upper thorax. And this is the answer to that question. When you move your eyes, you always move your neck. There's little neck muscles that move. And those little neck muscles help stabilize your eyes. So you're looking at a target. There's a relationship between the target and your eye position. But as your eye position shifts, now your whole awareness of space shifts. and your neck moves also. You can move your neck side to side, up and down, or just the small muscles in your neck stabilize the eye movements. When the neck moves, it's linked with the upper back, and the upper back is linked with the shoulders. And then the upper back is also linked with the lower back, which is linked with the hips. So as I showed you on the previous slide, when we shift the hips and shoulders, it's actually affecting the eyes and neck. So we look at the prescriptions that people have and we try to balance them so that they are more stable. And a lot of our patients, we find that when they have these eyeglasses that sharpen their central sight really, really well, and they're seeing the wings on a butterfly 30 feet away, if we take away some of that sharpness of the center eyesight, it has a lessening effect of the distortion in the periphery and a changing of the auditory space, and they're more comfortable. So we were talking about stress thresholds. We changed the prescriptions to be less stressful. So you have this stress bucket. Everybody has their own threshold of how much stress they can handle before they go over the edge. And there's always just general stressors in life, but you also can have visual stressors and auditory stressors and emotional stressors. So we at the Mind Eye Institute take away the visual stressors and hopefully lower the level of your stress below the threshold so it doesn't push it over the edge. COVID-19 is affecting our immune systems, and that's an internal stressor. So it's affecting the thresholds also. We have a lot of people with long COVID coming in where they were sick and it's just dragging on and on and on. And it's because they're pushed over that threshold of stress level. And again, we take away the visual stress of it. And if it lowers the stress level to below the threshold, then the body can regain what it was doing before. It's not in adrenal mode. Thanks. What do we have? When you have stress visually, what it does is it shrinks and shrinks and shrinks your awareness. So you're looking through a tunnel. And I have a continuum drawn from a pen light mode to a floodlight mode. So if you think of being on stage with an audience, if the floodlight is turned on and all the stage is lit up, you don't know where to put your attention. So when your retina is all lit up and everything's pouring into it, and you don't know where to put attention, then that's what is labeled ADD. In a penlight mode or a spotlight on a theater, just one person's face would be lit up or one person's body. And then everybody in the audience knows where to look. And that's the same thing here. The more attention you put on one thing, the less awareness you have of the surroundings. So a neurotypical person would pay attention to one thing, but still maintain awareness of the rest. But a non-neurotypical person can tunnel and then just be oblivious. These people are labeled with autism or Asperger's, where they're unaware socially of what's going on around them. So everybody's retina can shift from floodlight to penlight mode, and it does all day long depending on what task you're doing. But some people tend to live in one more than the other. You can flip that. So we had a question on visual snow, so I wanted to address it a little bit. Sometimes visual snow is coming after COVID, and other times it comes after a head injury. Sometimes it comes after an infection that isn't COVID. But Charles Shidlovsky in Texas and Terry Tsang in California have been working with many, many other practitioners on something called the Visual Snow Initiative. And if you have visual snow, that's a really good thing to check out. I personally believe that visual snow is present all the time. It's the peripheral retina just on, and most people just can tune it out. But these people who are devastated by it, they don't know how to tune it out. And it's a skill that they have to relearn. So there's now a protocol to do that. It's a relearning of a skill to tune out your peripheral stimulation. Thanks. So people have eye-ear interactions all the time. You're listening to me and watching me. If it were to be frozen and you heard my words and then saw my mouth move separately. Or there's something called the McGurk phenomena, where they took a video of a person opening their mouth, saying ga, 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 and then they took an audio of the person saying ba, ba, ba with a closed mouth, and they put the audio of ba with the video of ga, and people's eyes would see an open mouth, but their ears would hear the closed mouth, and their brains would get stuck. And what they would then think it was is the sound da, which sounds like ba, but it has an open mouth. And then about 20 years after that was discovered, they did the same study on people with attention deficit, and they found that they didn't have the same effect. They didn't hear the da, they heard the ba. And it's because attention deficit patients didn't look at people's mouths. They just listened. And it's a really neat phenomena called the McGurk phenomena. You can close your eyes and hear ba, 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 and you open your eyes and you hear da, 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 unless you're attention deficit. So the eye interaction is really important, and it's a learned skill. So just as if you had a 2-year-old and you throw a ball at them and they don't catch it, you say, well, you're only 2. If you have a 10-year-old and you throw a ball at them and they don't catch it, you say, what's the matter with you? You're 10. You're supposed to learn by now. So the eye-ear connection is learned, and it's not learned right away. It's learned as they grow. So the eye-hand connection, just because you have eyes and have arms, does not mean you can juggle. So if you're in a room full of jugglers, you have the same equipment they have, eyes and hands, but you might not be able to because you didn't learn a skill. So the same thing goes with eyes and ears. Just because you have an eye and have an ear doesn't mean you're simultaneously able to look and listen. And that's what people don't realize in school districts, because over 20% of children don't link their eyes and ears. And now there's more and more studies showing that diseases affect the linkage between eyes and ears. They have studies with Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, autism is a big study from Vanderbilt, multiple sclerosis, schizophrenia, a whole bunch of different ones. And your eye-ear connection is disrupted in the diseases, or it's not learned in children with autism and learning disabilities. So just because you have ears and just because you have eyes does not mean you don't need something to connect them. Either games to build to learn the skill, or glasses that link the auditory space perceived with the visual space perceived. And just because you have 20/20 eyesight centrally doesn't mean you don't need glasses. You might need them to listen better. So lots of different people. People with PTSD have eye-ear things, eye-ear disconnects also. Thanks. So conventional central eyesight is emphasized in eye care, and in the mind eye, we emphasize peripheral eyesight. If you flip this. So if you're looking at a paper, what you see straight ahead of you, that's your central eyesight with attention. But the peripheral eyesight is whatever you're not paying attention to. So it could be the extra paragraph in a book. But the big peripheral is what people tend to think peripheral means, like looking at a sporting event. But you could also have peripheral straight in front of you, just not what you're looking directly at. So if you look at a word on a page, you're aware the end of the line is here, but you don't know what it says there because you didn't point your eyes there. The central part of your eye has to point at a word to see it. The peripheral part of your eye can just judge where something is, but not what it is. Thanks. So we talked about COVID already, and what else do we have? How mind-eye brain work can influence the perception of surrounding space. Well, we spoke about that a little bit already. At Mind-Eye, what we're doing is we're analyzing visual space perceived, and we're analyzing auditory space perceived. And we're figuring out what type of eyeglasses would blend the two, so that if you see a target in one place, but you hear it in a different place, it creates confusion. If you put the glasses on, you hear it and see it in the exact same spot, and it makes things more comfortable. Or as one of my patients said, I think on the next slide, is that the next slide? Nope, 2 slides down. Inside, oops, oh, no, go back 1 slide, sorry, go back. Yeah, and one of my patients says it'll come up later. There. 2 slides back. There. So in addition to just seeing something and looking at the targets and having the background and listening to the targets and having the background, think about what you have to do in a lecture or even like here. You're seeing facial expressions, you're watching body language. That's with 2 different parts of your eye. Facial expressions are with your central eyesight. The body language is with peripheral eyesight. Then you're hearing words, that's your central auditory, but you're also hearing a tone of voice, that's peripheral auditory. And all those 4 different streams of information have a right and a left side. So there's 8 different pieces of information pouring into people just to listen to something. And then when the information comes in, now your mind has to visualize things and then organize it. You have to make pictures in your head and you have to organize sounds and letters. Those are 2 of the things you have to do for reading, the visualization and organization. And you get people who grow up learning to organize their sounds, but not their sights, or vice versa. And then when they start to learn to read or to play games on computers or try to learn sight words versus sounding out words, they're good at one, but not good at the other. So what we do at the Mind Eye Institute is figure out with each patient which levels are not developed and then plug in where they're having weak spots and develop the skills that are fundamental skills and work from there. If you want to flip that. So I hope you learned the importance of having a mind-eye connection. Your eyes are taking in information from the outside environment, and then your brain is running with that information and having to sort out what's important, what's not important, and then pointing at what you want to look at. But in addition to that, the things that the neuroscience researchers are getting into and the brain mapping groups are getting into is that once the eyes send signals into the brain, the signals travel to a lot of different places. Some places link with sleep, like jet lag. Some link with mood disorders and mood regulation. Some link with appetite. We have a few patients who talk about body temperature awareness being different with glasses. There's other signals from the eye that link with posture centers, and some others with peripheral eyesight, some with fear centers, so that you can see something out of the corner of your eye and it can remind you of something that you're afraid of and then trigger a response. So there's so many different places that the optic nerve sends signals to. And then on top of that, the brain itself sends signals back into the eye to monitor and modulate what's going on. So there's all kinds of things happening in the brain and the eye. And the retina is the part of the brain, but the eye movements are governed by what the retinal processing and the brain processing together deems important. So it's a critical thing. Now, what happens when eye care becomes brain care? Here's an example of a student. This was shown a couple of years ago, and there was a student who was tested at school, and they stayed about the same until they had new mind-eye glasses and then kept getting better and better. I have another student like that who took a MAP test. Normally, you gain a few points each year. And this student took a test and had forgotten his glasses and then went back the next day to take a similar test, but a different version of it. And his score went up 5 points, which would be like a whole year of learning or more. So the glasses, when your eyes and ears are linked together comfortably, and the signals from your right and left come in comfortably and blended together, you are able to concentrate and put attention on what you want to put on the content of what you're looking at. What else do you have? So again, when eye care becomes brain care, what happens? This is where my patient made something up, the next one. Right. So we're going to conclude, and I'm leaving time for questions if we have any, and I have something in case we don't have any. So in conclusion, leave 2020 testing in the 20th century for the people whose brains need more testing. When eyeglasses are prescribed for by the mind eye optometrists, such as myself, Dr. Adams, and Dr. Weil, they're designed for comfort, or as one of my patients said to me, 20 happy instead of 2020, because he'd way rather be happy and comfortable and not seeing the teeny, teeny, tiny details 20, 30 feet away. Because we get so many people in here that says, I have headaches, I have fatigue, I have light sensitivity and stomach aches and all these things. And they don't care if they can't see, letters that are an eighth of an inch tall, 20 feet away. They just want to be 20 happy. And eyeglasses can affect and intentionally change brain function and build a better brain. So thank you for listening. I left about 20 minutes for questions.
Yeah, so we have one question in the chat that asks if you work with Parkinson's patients. They're asking, they find your work amazing, and they wonder if they could be helped because they've had some symptoms since childhood.
They've had symptoms since childhood, but they haven't had Parkinson's since childhood.
We could let them clarify that in the chat further, but yeah, Parkinson's symptoms, I guess, is the main overall.
Well, how old are they now?
We could circle back for that to come around.
So the general answer, not a specific answer, is yes, we work with Parkinson's patients. I have two grandfathers each who had Parkinson's, so it's of value to me. Anyway, because we do work. Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative disease, so you can't fix Parkinson's, but what you can do is make it more palatable by making balance more stable. So if you think of women who wear high-heeled shoes and they run around in 2-inch high heels, and other people who run around in flat shoes, and some who run around in 1-inch heels. Parkinson's would be like having one high-heeled shoe and one flat shoe and trying to get around. It's much harder, and you're a little bit off balance, and you don't receive the signals from your body properly. So what we can do is create more adaptability and build skills up for that. That's the gross answer, the general answer. If they can give specifics, it'll be a lot easier to answer that.
They did respond saying they're 67, and
when did they get the Parkinson's?
That unclear, but slowness is what they said is their main symptom.
So if slowness is their symptom, I'm assuming slow to talk or slow to move, because thinking and moving are two different things.
Also depth perception.
Different. So the answer is yeah. Well, depth perception, that's easy to work with, so sure, because that's visual space awareness. But if they were saying they're slow to talk, then that's thinking, and that's a lot of cerebellar things. The cerebellum is what smooths out muscle movements. So what's interesting with Parkinson's is that if you're moving, it's jerky, but if you get scared and you move without thinking first, you often have a smoother movement. So the unconscious movements are still smooth, but the conscious or subconscious are jerkier sometimes when there's a jolt of emotions in there.
Cool. Do you have any studies or information on how TMS or transcranial magnetic stimulation treatment for depression can affect hearing or seeing systems?
I don't have, I mean, there's different types of TMS. We actually, I belong to a science group and we just spoke about TMS this afternoon and how originally TMS wasn't included in insurance codes, and we were talking about how they got there, and fMRI is the same way. I don't have any studies that specifically are linking TMS to visual space.
Okay. How about the effects of post-concussion syndrome, like, for example, eye pain, head pain, etc.?
Yeah, that's described in The Ghost in My Brain very, very well. We have a lot of post-concussion patients, probably 20 a week at least. So there's close to 1,000 a year. The Ghost in My Brain book came out in 2015. So since then we've had eight years. But before that, I was working with brain injury patients even as far back as 1985. So I've been with brain injury and legally blind people for almost 40 years now, 38 years. So post-concussion symptoms we deal with all the time. And you again have to do the same thing. You see how much you can tolerate the stress, how much sensory mismatch is there, and how to help get it back and what skills are needed to be rebuilt.
Okay. Do you have any literature or studies on the Mind-Eye Institute's work having efficacy for either delaying the effects of existing macular degeneration or even potentially reversing it?
No, Stuart Richer's work has, so Stuart Richer, who just died last fall, he had a lot of work specifically on macular degeneration and how it was reversible. So you could look up his work. His last name is Richer, Richer. First name Stuart, Stuart. And he did plenty of discoveries. He worked with he worked with diet and how it affected the development of the macula. I taught a course for the legally blind people at the Blind Services Association in downtown Chicago, and they have a lot of patients with macular degeneration. So we didn't do formal studies, but we did a group called the Macular Connection, and it was an 8-week program to alleviate the symptoms from their macular degeneration and teach them to learn to see a different way. And that had quite a bit of results. So I can put that, if somebody wants to write an email separately, I can hook you up with the Blind Services Association, or you can call them directly at 312-236-0808. And you can get an answer that way.
All right, great. How does vision link to motor function? I got an MTBI, and when I get too visually stimulated, I can't move or talk.
So if you go back to the earlier slide that looks like a spider, you can't go back to the slides? No more slides. Well, there was a slide that looked like a spider, and there's visual inputs from, there were green lines going into the eye, and then there were red lines at the bottom coming out. That was the motor skills. So the question is that when he gets overwhelmed visually, he freezes? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so when they get visually stimulated, they have a hard time moving and or talking.
So that tells me you're going into freeze mode. When we talked about fight or flight or freeze, you're telling me you're going into freeze mode, which means you pushed your stress level over the threshold. So that would be an easy thing to deal with. That's a math puzzle, which is what I excel at.
Great. How young can someone be treated? I have a 3-year-old with eye issues.
Yeah, we treat babies at we assess babies at 4.5 months, because if there's anything brewing, you can catch it then. And in a 4.5, 5-month-old baby, it's really easy to fix because you have complete control over the baby's life. By the time they're 3 and they're walking and talking, it's a little harder to coerce them to do things. But if you have a 3-year-old with problems, that's easily within our age limits. We see a lot of babies and 1-year-olds, and especially now that on the advisory board with the Hope for HIE, a lot of these babies come in and they're 8 months, 10 months, 12 months. And some children with genetic disorders who aren't growing properly. So 3 would be old compared to the small children we see.
Great. Does eye care affect someone with high functioning Asperger's in any way?
Yes, because a high functioning Asperger's often doesn't have good social skills. And that is visual awareness and auditory awareness, as I talked about earlier. A high functioning Asperger's, sometimes the people spend their time in their head. So you have an internal awareness and an external awareness. The external is the target and the backgrounds, like we've been talking about constantly. But the internal in a high functioning Asperger's would be dealing with details and concepts and listening for either details or concepts but not necessarily putting them together. So it's fun to work with those types of patients because they're usually extremely intelligent, but missing some little like key that would open up to get them to interact with the environment more comfortably.
Okay. You might have touched on this one a little bit, but is there a link between post-concussive symptoms that include limited depth perception and eye care?
Yeah, that's the same question
Same.
from earlier.
Okay. Yeah.
Post-concussive syndrome, PCS, is got a myriad of symptoms, and that's since The Ghost in My Brain came out by Clark Elliott, we've seen lots of people with lots of symptoms. Depth perception is a fancy way to say that using the use of peripheral eyesight and central eyesight, you blend the peripheral eyesight of the right and left eye, and then you use the central eyesight to see a target, and depth perception would be judging where the target is with respect to its background.
Okay. Dr. Adams referred me out for retained reflex work. How will that work along with the mind-eye regimen?
It works to lay the foundation. Primitive reflexes are something that every baby is born with, and they're survival reflexes. So for instance, when a baby is born and it comes out of the mother, the doctor turns their head, it rotates the neck of a baby, and that allows their shoulder to come out, and they kind of come out like a corkscrew from the mother. And that's one reflex that's in every baby. But then as the baby grows, they eventually learn to separate their neck movement from their shoulder movement. So in people who don't separate them and isolate the movements, then let's say if they're riding a bicycle and they turn their head, the shoulder will turn and then the whole bicycle will go to one side or the other. So I don't know the age of the patient who's talking, but if it's somebody who has retained primitive reflexes, meaning they never went away, then the practitioners who work with that isolate the movements of the head from the shoulders and the shoulders from the hips and the hips from the knees and the ankles. So you need separate isolated parts of you to move and be functional. Anat Banyel has a method which she uses the ANAT, and then Banyel is like Daniel with a B. So anatbanyelmethod.com, and she calls it neuro movement and deals with circuitry and how the whole person interacts with the environment. But so the question is, how would that retained reflex work be like dovetailing with mind-eye? We're working with perception of the environment, and the reflex work is working with the body. So the reflex work works with the body against gravity, and we're working with how the person perceives their environment, both auditory and visual, and how they're linked together. If the environment is blended, but the body's not good against gravity and there's not postural stability, you're going to have a problem. So Dr. Adams probably referred so that the foundation could be laid so that the person could be fighting gravity effortlessly and we could deal with the environment.
Great, thank you. My wife had a stroke in the occipital lobe. Sorry.
The occipitable?
Yeah, thank you.
How about the occipital?
Yeah,
the bowl.
left side vision has been damaged.
Uh-huh.
Is there a treatment to help with this kind of problem? For context, the stroke was in October. It has improved some, but it gives an unstable or unsteady feeling when walking.
Yes, there's ways. You can't bring, as of this point in 2023, there's no particular ways that people know to bring the eyesight back. There are some companies who can bring a little back. There's things you can do to stimulate, but I wouldn't have your wife be hoping to get her eyesight back the way it was. However, there are many, many ways in your mind where you can learn to ignore that part of the field and do it in your head. So if I had a blackness on the left side of me, I could in my mind envision what would be over there. I could learn how to use sounds to judge how far away things are. I could also learn, Neil Margolis made a Margolis eye throwing technique where if you're walking and you're missing half of your field, you look and glance and then come back to straight ahead. But what you've glimpsed, you take in your mind and you picture the thing. So there's plenty you can do to learn visual imagery to not be unstable when you're walking. And there's also glasses that could be put on to, again, link the auditory and visual and to shift the postural stability in order to function better.
Okay, great. And this is a follow-up to the previous question about how for young children, this person has a 3-year-old who is farsighted with a +4 and a +3 prescription for his glasses, and he's had them since 15 months. However, what's unique about this case is he has gravitational insecurity and seems to have freakouts when walls, floors, and ceilings are similar shades and big blue open skies.
Why does that make it so unusual?
Well, I guess I added that qualifier, but if it's not unusual, I guess
It's not unusual to be
Okay, yeah.
gravitationally insecure when you have a +4 and a +3 and you're 3 years old.
Okay,
So-
yeah. Yeah.
So what is the actual question?
I guess that was not so much a question as much of adding on to it, but if there was a specific question you wanted us to ask on that one there, Sarah, let us know and we'll get back around to it. Let's see, the next one. I'm a patient at Mind Eye for brain injury. My results so far have been incredible, absolutely life-changing. What steps can I take to learn to help others in the way that Mind Eye does once I'm fully recovered? What steps would I need to take in education?
That's a great question. That I would have Adam answer.
Well, I think given how many other practitioners that work in not doing exactly what Mind Eye does, but kind of complementary treatments, there's really a lot of different avenues you could take to address some of these same kind of root causes for the struggles people are reporting. But I think any steps are good steps often, right? And the more books you read on the subjects and the more kind of adjacently related fields you introduce yourself to, I think the more you'll realize what's a good fit for you and what's not.
Also, one of the things I'm doing as the president of the Society for Brain Mapping is to change policy. So currently the insurance codes are specifically for eyeball things and eye movement things and eyesight. So you have eye health, eye movement, and eyesight. And there aren't any insurance codes for all the new connections that are being discovered in the last 5-10 years between the optic nerve and various parts of the brain. So if you wanted to head into policy or lobbying, stuff like that, there's going to be letters to the editor written. There's going to be papers, there's forms to fill out for agencies, that type of thing. So it really depends if you're looking to get into the scientific aspect, as Adam said, or into policy changing and public awareness.
Okay. I was told by a neuroscientist that any head injuries before the age of 2 does not impact one later in adult life. What are your thoughts on this? I've had several head injuries before the age of 3, and I'll be 39 in a couple of months.
My thoughts are any head injury anywhere, especially before the age of 2, are very life-changing. I think what the neuroscientist might have meant was that the brain can kind of regenerate. So, I mean, you can have children who have brain surgery before the age of 2, and their brains just kind of regrow pathways. So I think you might have misunderstood what they said. When you are younger than age 2 and you have injuries, it's going to disrupt your development. So you have auditory skills that develop in a sequence, visual skills developing, and motor skills developing. If they don't all link together at various times, you're going to have problems. And any major injuries before too. Is going to trigger the immune system, the survival system. Your reflexes are not going to integrate, and you're going to have primitive reflexes.
Great. We did get a little bit more context with the patient with the,
Oh, the
or
plus
person
four
with
and the plus three.
Yep,
Yeah.
that one.
Okay.
So when the walls, ceiling, and floor are the same, our 3-year-old is paralyzed by fear and starts crying hysterically.
Mhm.
1 minute he will be fine in this space, and the next he's not.
Mhm.
He puts his hand out as if the floor is moving. He
Mhm.
says things like, "The ceiling will not touch us." We question if the prescription 3-4 is a helping one thing, the close-up vision, but causing complications for sensory vestibular.
Likely, yes. Because the 3 and the 4 and a 3-year-old, usually you don't ask a 3-year-old which is better, 1 or 2, 3 or 4. You put eye drops in them and you measure what light will make the center of their eye develop. So the first thing I'd want to know, since you have 2 different powers, is number 1, can he see equally out of each eye, or is the plus 4 eye an embryo? Is the central part of the plus 4 eye working or not working? The second thing would be what his auditory awareness is. And then the third thing would be what you're describing is what scientists describe when they go visit polar bears. We had a lecture from a man who said that he went into an icy place looking at white polar bear. Everything was white. The ice was white, the floors, the ceiling, and it was all uniform. And they had everybody who was walking there was falling and not being able to balance because their peripheral eyesight was the same all over the place. So that's what you're describing your kid's peripheral eyesight as not giving cues of where the floor was. And so that tells me that the glasses are not they're not designed for his periphery, they're designed to activate the central part of his eye. So and then if the plus 4 eye is starting to turn inward, as it says here, then that's his shoulder starting, like I showed earlier with the shoulder and the neck. So yeah, the prescription is designed, I'm going to assume it's a good eye doctor and they did a great job, and the child measures 3 and 4, but the measurements are designed around central eyesight of a target that's not moving, and it's not accounting for peripheral eyesight when they're walking. So yeah, we'd love to get involved with that, because you also have to have the child move their eyes side to side. I'd ask, can they voluntarily move their eyes up and down? Because you're also describing a child who's not aware of where their eyes are pointing. And if they can't move it up and down or sideways, what happens if they're lying on their back and they're looking up and you move your hand? Can they follow? So if they can do it when they're lying flat in their bed, but they cannot do it standing up fighting gravity, then that's exactly what I was saying. You have your target to your eye to your head, the head to the body, and the body to gravity. And you have to look at all of that. You can't just look at the eyeball as a separate piece. And it says hates laying down on his back. That's the same kid.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we deal with. So bring him in. That's like a number 1 emergency. Do they live here in Chicago?
We'll let them
Oh, right.
say that, but so for now we'll move on. So this one person says, "I'm 33 now, and I wonder if there's a time limit for continued improvement."
No, I've done 95, 98-year-olds. It's years and years ago, I had a 95-year-old who wanted to read and couldn't because her legal blindness was so bad. And I was 20 something. And I remember saying, well, why would you want to read? Just, have somebody read to you. And she stuck her finger in my face and said, don't tell me what I need. Just give me what I need to do. I'll work at home. She worked real hard and she ended up reading. That's
Great. Can a macular hole be overcome?
Macular hole is a different entity. When you say overcome, no. If it's fully there's a full thickness hole and a partial thickness hole. So I'm going to assume what they're talking about is a full thickness hole. So you cannot overcome it, but you can learn to ignore it, because there's another macula on the other eye. So, and you only really need one macula at a time. You don't need the other macula. You need both peripheries. You don't need both maculas. So the answer is, yeah, you can overcome it. But if it's bothering you, what we would do in that case is put a lens to blur you blur the macula and you activate the periphery, so the two peripheries work really well together, and then you shift your attention to the other macula. So it's a learned skill, but it's learnable.
Great. Have you treated any autism patient yet? And are there any success stories?
Lots. We had, I mean, I've worked with Autism 1 since the late 90s, mid 90s, late 90s. I've spoken many times at Autism 1. And then if you read the book Outsmarting Autism, the yellow version that's newer by Patricia Lemmer, that has a whole page on what she's witnessed that we've done with autistic children. Our most astounding one is a child who was going to be put into special ed in a grammar school. He came here at Thanksgiving time, and we put glasses on him to link eyes and ears. And when he went back to school after Christmas break in January, they put him in the gifted class. So he wasn't able to read. He was in 3rd grade. He wasn't able to read even at a kindergarten level at Thanksgiving. And in mid-January, he was reading at almost a 4th grade level. And so, you know, he went from needing special ed classes to being in the gifted class. So, yeah.
Okay. Looks like we have about time for, let's say, one more.
Okay.
Do you have any literature studies regarding the efficacy for cerebral-based thought dissymmetry? Sorry, these are a lot of big words. That may be masquerading as schizophrenic thought disorganization.
I personally don't have any, but there's a guy named Paul Lazzari, I think it's Lazz, I think ARI. He has studies on schizophrenics and retinal thinning. So the answer is yes, but I don't have the studies. He does. And if you write to info@mindeye.com, I can get you the link to his study.
Okay, great. And actually, one more. Can you evaluate someone without a diagnosis and describe how their visual system is functioning and how they might improve on certain dimensions? That is to say, can you see how their eyes and other systems are working together or not?
Well, when they say visual system, to me, there's lots and lots and lots of visual systems. So which are they talking about? All of them? Because
Likely, yeah.
So assuming they're talking about how the answer is yes, that's what we do. So what they just did is said in a nutshell what we do. We look at all the visual systems. It's, you know, from eyesight systems, which is what some people call the visual system, to what they call where am I? So spatial orientation, spatial organization, localization, identification. You look at the linkages between the optic nerve and the endocrine functions, limbic functions, autonomic functions, skeletal muscles. So you look at everything and then find out where there's something missing that's not in the normal range, and then see how you can address it. And so, yeah, what you just described is what we do.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in and participating. We got a lot of good questions. I know we weren't able to get to some, and we got some questions beforehand too that we weren't able to get to. We'll be following up with those when we send out the recording of this webinar sometime next week. If you have any other questions once you go home and are thinking about some of what we've talked about today, definitely follow up with us at info@mindeye.com. We'll be able to answer your questions there as well.
So you're going to have the director's cut that we send where we have me on video answering all the other questions. Okay.
Sure. I think that would be wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Take care and good night.